The most dangerous lie is the one everyone wants to believe. The courtroom in downtown Phoenix was so quiet that Michael Carter could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning above the polished wood panels. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long golden rectangles across the floor, but the warmth never seemed to reach him. He sat at the far end of the room beside his attorney, hands folded tightly in his lap, while every eye appeared fixed on the woman across from him. Rebecca Carter looked exactly how a jury of strangers might imagine a victim should look. Her shoulders were slightly lowered. Her voice trembled at just the right moments. A tissue rested between her fingers. Even from 20 feet away, Michael could see the tears glistening beneath the courtroom lights. The judge listened carefully. The attorneys listened carefully. Even the spectators seated in the back row seemed drawn into every word she spoke. "I trusted him," Rebecca said softly. "For years, I trusted him." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Michael stared ahead without moving. He had spent months preparing himself for this day, yet nothing could prepare him for the feeling of hearing his life rewritten by someone who knew every chapter. Rebecca described a marriage that barely resembled the one he remembered. She spoke about financial secrecy. She implied betrayal. She painted a picture of a husband who cared more about money than family. Every sentence landed with the precision of a carefully placed brick, slowly building a wall between Michael and everyone in the room. He noticed the expression on the court reporter's face. He noticed the way one of the spectators shook her head. He noticed the glance exchanged between two people sitting near the back. They believed her. Maybe not completely. Maybe not yet. But they wanted to. That was enough. Michael's attorney leaned closer and whispered something, but he barely heard it. His attention remained fixed on Rebecca. Not because he hated her. Not because he wanted revenge. He simply could not understand how someone could sound so convincing while telling a story that felt so far from the truth. Rebecca never raised her voice. She never appeared angry. In many ways, that made her testimony more powerful. Calm confidence carried farther than shouting ever could. The judge asked a question. Rebecca answered immediately. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just a smooth response delivered with practiced composure. Pens moved across notepads. Documents changed hands. The hearing continued. Outside, traffic rolled through the streets of Phoenix under a cloudless Arizona sky. Inside, Michael felt as though the walls were slowly closing around him. For the first time since the divorce proceedings had begun, he realized this was no longer simply a legal dispute. It had become something else entirely. A battle over perception. A battle over credibility. A battle over which version of reality people would choose to accept. Then Rebecca looked directly at the judge and spoke a sentence that seemed to settle over the room like dust. Everything I've said today can be verified. Several heads nodded almost instinctively. Michael remained motionless. But somewhere deep beneath the frustration, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the growing fear that he was losing everything, a small feeling stirred. Not hope. Not yet. Just a quiet certainty that something about this picture was wrong. And sooner or later, the truth would have to find its way into the room. By the time the hearing ended that afternoon, the damage had already begun spreading beyond the courthouse walls. Michael Carter stepped out into the Arizona heat and paused near the bottom of the courthouse steps. The temperature hovered near 90 degrees, but he barely noticed it. His phone had been vibrating non-stop for almost an hour. Messages. Missed calls. Notifications. Most people did not ask questions when they believed they already knew the answer. Michael unlocked the screen and immediately wished he had not. A former coworker had sent a short message saying he was sorry things had turned out this way. Another simply said, "I never expected this from you." Neither message asked whether the allegations were true. They assumed they were. Across town, Rebecca's version of events was already moving faster than the legal process itself. Family members who had once spent holidays at Michael's house suddenly stopped returning calls. Friends who had known him for years became distant. Even people who barely knew the details seemed comfortable choosing sides. It amazed him how quickly certainty could replace curiosity. That evening, Michael drove back to the house he had rented after the separation. The small property sat on a quiet street lined with desert landscaping and neatly trimmed yards. Normally, he appreciated the silence. Tonight, it felt different. Empty. The garage door opened slowly, revealing shelves stacked with moving boxes that still had not been unpacked. 8 months earlier, he had believed the divorce would be difficult but fair. Now he was no longer sure fairness had anything to do with it. He dropped his keys on the kitchen counter and stared at the framed photograph standing beside the coffee maker. The picture had been taken during a family vacation near Sedona years earlier. Everyone was smiling. The memory felt distant now, almost like it belonged to someone else's life. Michael turned the frame face down. Not out of anger. Out of exhaustion. The next morning, things became worse. At work, conversations stopped when he entered the break room. People avoided eye contact. One manager who had always greeted him with a smile suddenly seemed in a hurry to be somewhere else. Nobody said anything directly. They did not need to. The silence communicated enough. By lunchtime, Michael realized that Rebecca had not only challenged him in court. She had managed to reshape how people saw him. Reputation, he discovered, could take decades to build and only days to weaken. Yet amid the frustration, one detail refused to leave his mind. It was not the tears. It was not the accusations. It was not even the sympathy she had received from nearly everyone in the courtroom. It was a single sentence buried among hours of testimony. The judge had asked Rebecca when she first became aware of certain financial records she claimed had alarmed her. Rebecca answered immediately. Too immediately. She gave a date. A very specific date. At the time, the answer seemed insignificant. Nobody reacted. Nobody questioned it. But Michael remembered exactly where he had been that week. He remembered because it had been one of the most important business trips of his career. The date sounded wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not obviously impossible. Just wrong enough to linger. As the sun set behind the Phoenix skyline that evening, Michael sat alone at his dining room table reviewing notes from the hearing. He read the transcript excerpt again. Then again. The more he looked at that single statement, the less comfortable he became. For the first time since the divorce proceedings began, he stopped focusing on everything Rebecca had said and started focusing on one thing she might have said incorrectly. And sometimes, the smallest crack is where the truth begins to show. The next morning, Michael arrived at his office nearly an hour before anyone else. The parking lot was still half empty, and the desert air carried the last traces of coolness before another Arizona afternoon would push temperatures into the 90s. He carried a cardboard file box from his car and set it carefully on his desk. Inside were bank statements, travel records, old emails, tax documents, and years of paperwork that most people would have thrown away long ago. Until now, Michael had spent his energy defending himself against accusations. For the first time, he decided to do something different. He would stop reacting and start examining. The date Rebecca had mentioned during her testimony continued to bother him. It was a small detail, almost invisible among the larger allegations. Yet the more he thought about it, the more it felt like a loose thread hanging from an expensive suit. Most people would never notice it. But once you saw it, it became impossible to ignore. Michael opened his laptop and pulled up his calendar archives. The specific week Rebecca had referenced appeared immediately. Meetings. Flight confirmations. Hotel reservations. Client presentations. Every hour of nearly every day was documented. He remembered the trip clearly now. A major contract negotiation in Denver. 4 days away from home. Nearly 1,000 miles from Phoenix. He printed several records and laid them across his desk. Then he reached for the hearing notes. Rebecca had testified that she discovered the financial information while Michael was supposedly at home. The statement sounded ordinary when spoken aloud. Looking at the dates side by side, however, something felt off. Not impossible. Not dramatic. Just inconsistent. Michael leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling tiles above him. His attorney had warned him against becoming obsessed with tiny details. Courts focused on larger patterns. Judges did not usually reverse decisions because of a single discrepancy. Still, he could not shake the feeling that this mattered. Around noon, his attorney, David Reynolds, called. David had spent more than 20 years handling complex family law cases throughout Arizona. He was not easily surprised. When Michael explained what he found, there was a long pause on the line. "You might be chasing something important," David finally said. "Or you might be chasing nothing. The problem is that we do not know which one yet." That answer should have discouraged him. Instead, it strengthened his resolve. Because for the first time in months, someone was not telling him to ignore his instincts. After work, Michael returned home and continued digging through records spread across his dining room table. Receipts. Travel itineraries. Credit card statements. The evidence created a timeline of ordinary life. Yet the timeline did not align neatly with Rebecca's testimony. Hours passed. Darkness settled outside the windows. The only light came from a small lamp near the corner of the room. Then Michael found something unexpected. An old email chain. At first glance, it seemed completely unrelated. A routine exchange involving schedules and account access. Nothing dramatic. Nothing incriminating. Yet one message contained a timestamp that placed Rebecca somewhere different from where she claimed to have been. Michael read it twice. Then a third time. The room suddenly felt quieter. He was not looking at proof. Not yet. But he was looking at the first piece of information that directly contradicted her version of events. For weeks, Michael had felt like a man standing alone against a story everyone else accepted. Now, sitting at a table covered with documents, he realized something important. Stories could be persuasive. Stories could be emotional. Stories could even sound true. But timelines did not care about emotions. Dates did not care about sympathy. Facts remained where they were placed. And somewhere inside those facts, Michael was beginning to suspect that Rebecca had made a mistake she never expected anyone to find. 3 days later, Michael sat across from David Reynolds inside a conference room overlooking downtown Phoenix. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the afternoon sun, painting the glass towers outside in shades of gold and copper. Between them sat a growing stack of documents. Some contained financial records. Others held travel confirmations, archived emails, and calendar entries stretching back several years. None of it looked dramatic. Yet David had spent the entire morning reviewing every page with unusual concentration. Finally, he placed one document on top of the stack and tapped it gently with a pen. "This is where things become interesting," he said. Michael leaned forward. The document was not one of the larger pieces of evidence. It was a routine activity report generated by an internal account management system. Most people would have ignored it completely. David pointed toward a series of timestamps. "Look at these dates." Michael already had. Several times. What had once seemed like a minor inconsistency now appeared larger with every review. Rebecca's testimony relied heavily on a sequence of events she claimed unfolded during a specific period. But the records were beginning to suggest something different. Not just a mistaken memory. An entirely different timeline. David opened another folder. I had my paralegal compare everything from that week, he explained. Emails. Login histories. Access records. Meeting schedules. We are starting to see gaps. The word lingered in Michael's mind. Gaps. Because that was exactly what this felt like. Rebecca's story looked complete from a distance. Yet when examined closely, entire sections seemed to disappear. Events appeared without explanation. Decisions happened without context. Important details existed in one document but vanished from another. For the first time since the hearing, Michael felt something stronger than frustration. Curiosity. That evening, he returned home carrying copies of the files David had highlighted. He spread them across the dining room table and began mapping dates onto a legal notepad. One day connected to another. Then another. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Rebecca's version of events moved smoothly from point A to point B. The documents suggested there had been something in between. Nearly a full week. 7 days that seemed strangely absent whenever she described the timeline. Michael stared at the notes. 7 days was a long time. Long enough for conversations. Long enough for decisions. Long enough for important actions to occur. Yet in testimony, emails, and supporting statements, those days appeared almost invisible. The next morning, he drove to a small coffee shop near Camelback Road before work. The location had become his unofficial thinking space during the divorce. Sitting near the window with a notebook and a black coffee, he reviewed everything again. The more he studied the timeline, the more unusual it became. Then he noticed another detail. Several communications that should have occurred during that missing week appeared to have been deleted from the records provided during discovery. Not all of them. Just enough to create questions. Michael felt his pulse quicken. Deletions could happen for innocent reasons. Files could be lost. Messages could be overlooked. But combined with the timeline inconsistencies, the omissions felt harder to dismiss. Later that afternoon, David called with an update. His voice sounded more serious than usual. We found additional account activity connected to that same period, he said. Nothing conclusive yet. But whoever organized the timeline wanted attention focused on certain days and away from others. Michael looked through the windshield at the traffic moving along the freeway. For months, he had felt trapped inside someone else's narrative. Now, for the first time, he could see the outline of a different story beginning to emerge. Not a complete story. Not yet. Just enough to reveal that an entire week of the truth might still be hiding somewhere in the shadows. The following week brought something Michael had not expected. A name from the past resurfaced. It happened on a Thursday afternoon while he was leaving his office. His phone rang just as he reached the parking garage elevator. The number was unfamiliar. Under normal circumstances, he would have ignored it. Lately, however, every unexpected call felt significant. Michael Carter, a woman's voice asked after he answered. Yes. There was a brief pause. You probably do not remember me. My name is Lauren Mitchell. Michael stopped walking. The name sounded familiar, though it took several seconds to place it. Lauren had worked with Rebecca years earlier. Not a close friend. Not family. Just someone who had spent nearly 2 years as an administrative coordinator at the consulting firm where Rebecca once held a management position. Michael had met her only a handful of times during company events. I remember you, he said carefully. Another pause followed. I have been following the court proceedings. Michael immediately became cautious. Since the hearing began, several people had reached out offering opinions, rumors, or second-hand information. None of it had proven useful. Lauren's next sentence changed everything. There are things about that timeline that do not make sense. Michael remained silent. He had learned the value of letting people continue talking. "I did not want to get involved," Lauren said. "Honestly, I still do not. But after watching everything unfold, I keep thinking about something I saw back then." Michael felt his grip tighten around the phone. The parking garage suddenly seemed very quiet. Lauren explained that during the same missing week Michael and David had been investigating, she had handled scheduling requests connected to Rebecca's department. At the time, nothing appeared unusual. Years later, however, certain details stood out differently. "I cannot tell you everything over the phone," she said. "And I am not accusing anyone of anything. I am only saying." There were meetings that never appeared on the official calendar. Michael's heart began to beat faster. Not because he finally had answers. Because for the first time, someone completely independent had noticed the same missing section of the timeline. They agreed to meet the following evening at a small restaurant in Scottsdale. Nothing fancy. Just a quiet place where conversation could happen without attracting attention. When Friday arrived, Michael reached the restaurant 15 minutes early. Lauren arrived carrying a leather portfolio and an expression that suggested she had spent days debating whether she should come. After ordering coffee, she opened the portfolio and slid several printed pages across the table. Most were old scheduling records. Internal communications. Routine administrative documents. On their own, they appeared insignificant. Together, they painted a different picture. Several entries referenced meetings that never appeared in the records submitted during discovery. Some involved dates from the missing week. Others referenced conversations that contradicted portions of Rebecca's testimony. Lauren kept her voice calm. "I cannot prove why these records disappeared," she said. "I only know they existed." Michael examined the pages carefully. None of them delivered a dramatic revelation. There was no single document that solved the entire mystery. Yet that was exactly what made them valuable. Real truth rarely arrived all at once. It emerged piece by piece. Fact by fact. Date by date. As the evening continued, Lauren revealed one final detail. Months before the divorce filing, a shared digital folder had existed inside Rebecca's department. According to company policy, the folder should have remained archived indefinitely. Instead, it vanished. No explanation. No record of transfer. No documented reason. Lauren looked directly at Michael. "I always wondered why." Driving home beneath the glow of Arizona streetlights, Michael replayed the conversation again and again. The missing week was no longer just a theory. Another person had seen the gaps. Another person had noticed records that no longer existed. And somewhere beyond those missing files, Michael could feel the outline of a larger truth waiting to be uncovered. Monday morning began with an email that neither Michael nor David expected to receive. The subject line contained only 4 words: "Archive recovery request approved." Michael read the message twice before forwarding it to David. During the previous week, David had quietly submitted a legal request seeking access to backup records connected to the vanished company folder Lauren mentioned. Neither of them had believed the request would succeed so quickly. Large organizations rarely moved fast. Yet somehow, the approval had arrived. By noon, Michael was sitting inside David's office as a secure download transferred onto a workstation. The progress bar crawled forward 1 percentage point at a time. Neither man spoke much. The room felt charged with anticipation. They had spent weeks uncovering fragments. Now they were about to discover whether those fragments belonged to something larger. Finally, the transfer completed. Thousands of archived files appeared on the screen. Most looked routine. Meeting notes. Internal reports. Scheduling documents. The kind of material that fills corporate servers every day. David assigned a litigation analyst to begin sorting through the archive. Hours passed. Then another unexpected discovery emerged. Several folders had clearly been removed from the original directory structure. Yet traces remained inside the backup system. Digital footprints. References pointing toward files that once existed but had later been deleted. The analyst called David over. "Look at this." Michael moved closer. The screen displayed a sequence of folder names and recovery logs. One particular folder appeared repeatedly throughout the archive history. It had been created, modified, accessed, and eventually erased. What made it unusual was not its existence. It was the timing. Every recorded activity aligned with the same missing week that had dominated their investigation. Michael felt his pulse quicken. They still did not know what the folder contained. But for the first time, they had confirmation that something significant had occupied that period. Something important. Enough to leave traces throughout multiple systems. David leaned back in his chair. "This is no longer about memory," he said quietly. "Now we have technology telling us the timeline is incomplete." Over the next several days, the recovery process continued. Most of the deleted material remained inaccessible. Some files had been overwritten. Others were too damaged to reconstruct. Yet one section of the archive produced an unexpected result. A partial recovery. Not complete documents. Not entire folders. Fragments. Metadata. File names. Timestamps. Enough to reveal patterns. Michael spent each evening reviewing updates from the legal team. The deeper they looked, the clearer the picture became. Activities had occurred during that missing week that never appeared in Rebecca's testimony. Communications existed that had never been disclosed. Certain records appeared to have vanished shortly before the divorce proceedings began. Then, late Thursday afternoon, David called with unusual urgency. "I need you here." 20 minutes later, Michael entered the office. The litigation analyst was already waiting beside the conference table. A single printed page sat in front of them. At first glance, it looked almost meaningless. A recovery report generated from backup data. Yet one line immediately captured Michael's attention. The report referenced a locked archive file. Unlike the others, this file had not been destroyed. It still existed somewhere inside the backup environment. The problem was access. The archive required credentials that no longer appeared in active company records. The room fell silent. After everything they had uncovered, the possibility that the most important information remained trapped behind a single digital barrier felt almost unbelievable. David studied the report carefully. Then a faint smile appeared. It was the first smile Michael had seen from him in weeks. "Whoever created this archive expected it to stay hidden," he said. "Which means there is a very good chance it contains exactly what we have been looking for." As the Arizona sunset painted the city skyline beyond the windows, Michael stared at the report lying on the table. Weeks earlier, he had been fighting accusations. Now he was standing one step away from a locked piece of the past. And for the first time, he could feel the truth getting closer. The final hearing arrived on a clear Tuesday morning in Phoenix. The sky outside was bright and cloudless, the kind of Arizona day that made everything appear calm from a distance. Inside the courthouse, however, tension hung in the air long before the proceedings began. Michael sat beside David Reynolds at the defense table, reviewing a small stack of notes. He appeared composed, but weeks of investigation, uncertainty, and sleepless nights had left their mark. Across the room, Rebecca Carter entered with the same confidence she had displayed during the earlier hearings. Her posture was relaxed. Her expression remained controlled. If she felt any concern, she did not show it. Several spectators had returned to observe the conclusion of a case that had quietly attracted attention. Some were friends. Others were colleagues. Most had already formed opinions. As the hearing began, Rebecca's attorney guided her through another round of testimony. Her answers flowed smoothly. Dates. Events. Financial records. The narrative remained familiar. Everything seemed carefully organized, as though every sentence had been rehearsed repeatedly. Michael listened without interruption. He no longer focused on the accusations themselves. Instead, he listened for details. Tiny details. The kind that often escaped notice when someone became too comfortable. Nearly an hour into the testimony, the moment arrived. It appeared insignificant at first. Rebecca was asked to clarify her activities during the disputed week that had become central to the investigation. Without hesitation, she repeated the same timeline she had presented before. The same sequence. The same dates. The same explanation. Her voice remained steady. Several people in the courtroom nodded as though hearing confirmation of facts they already accepted. Michael glanced toward David. The attorney did not react. Yet he slowly closed his notebook. A subtle movement. Almost invisible. Michael immediately understood what it meant. Rebecca had just repeated the statement that weeks of evidence had begun to dismantle. David rose from his chair and approached the podium. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. His tone remained polite. Professional. Measured. He asked Rebecca several simple questions. Nothing aggressive. Nothing dramatic. Questions about schedules. Meetings. Dates. She answered each one confidently. Then David introduced a document recovered during the investigation. Rebecca studied it briefly before responding. She insisted it changed nothing. Another document followed. Then another. Small pieces. Individual records. Nothing powerful enough on its own to transform the case. Yet each one created friction against the timeline she continued to defend. For the first time, tiny pauses began appearing between her answers. Fractions of a second. Barely noticeable. But they were there. David continued carefully. He never accused. He never raised his voice. He simply allowed the records to speak. The judge reviewed several exhibits. The courtroom clerk distributed copies. Paper shifted softly throughout the room. Michael watched Rebecca's expression. Not fear. Not panic. Something else. Confusion. The kind that appears when a person expects the conversation to move in one direction and suddenly realizes it is moving somewhere else. Then David referenced the missing week directly. Not with conclusions. With questions. Specific questions. Precise questions. Questions tied to recovered records, archived activity logs, and witnesses who had already provided statements. Rebecca answered. Then corrected herself. Then clarified. Small adjustments. Small inconsistencies. Individually, they seemed harmless. Together, they began creating a larger problem. The spectators sensed it. The judge sensed it. Even Rebecca's attorney appeared increasingly uncomfortable. Michael remained completely still. Weeks earlier, he had entered the process trying to prove his innocence. Now he understood something different. The truth rarely arrived through dramatic speeches. More often, it emerged when a false story became too heavy to carry. And as the hearing continued, Rebecca seemed to be carrying more weight with every answer she gave. The turning point arrived less than 30 minutes later. By then, the courtroom no longer felt certain about anything. The confidence that had surrounded Rebecca throughout the proceedings had begun to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. David Reynolds stood beside the evidence table and requested permission to introduce newly authenticated records obtained through archive recovery and independent verification. The judge reviewed the request carefully before granting it. A court clerk carried several folders forward. The sound of paper moving through the room seemed unusually loud. Michael watched as the first exhibit appeared on the courtroom monitors. It was not dramatic. Not a hidden video. Not a shocking photograph. Just a timeline. A simple timeline built from recovered metadata, archived communications, travel records, witness statements, and system activity logs. One by one, the entries appeared. Dates aligned beside timestamps. Meetings aligned beside account activity. Communications aligned beside calendar records. Standing alone, each piece seemed ordinary. Together, they formed something impossible to ignore. The missing week was no longer missing. David guided the court through the sequence patiently. Every step was documented. Every source was verified. Every timestamp matched independent records. Rebecca's attorney objected several times, but each objection was answered with supporting documentation. Then came the recovered archive report. The locked file itself had not remained inaccessible. During the previous days, technology specialists working under court authorization had successfully reconstructed portions of the archive contents. Not every file survived. Not every document could be restored. But enough remained. The screen displayed a series of recovered communications linked directly to the disputed period. Several messages referenced meetings that Rebecca previously denied occurred. Others referenced discussions that contradicted major portions of her testimony. A murmur spread quietly through the gallery before the judge immediately restored order. Rebecca stared at the monitor. For the first time that day, she appeared genuinely unsettled. David continued. He presented records from Lauren Mitchell's testimony. Then he introduced system logs showing the creation, modification, and deletion history of key files. The chronology revealed a pattern. Certain documents disappeared shortly before legal proceedings began. Other records were selectively preserved. The result was not a complete fabrication. It was something more complicated. A version of events that omitted critical facts. Michael noticed the judge making extensive notes. Page after page. Question after question. Then came the final exhibit. The courtroom fell completely silent as it appeared. It was a recovery summary prepared by independent forensic analysts. The report compared Rebecca's sworn timeline against verified digital records. The conclusion occupied only a few paragraphs. Yet its impact was immediate. Multiple statements could not be reconciled with the documented evidence. Several key events occurred on different dates than those described under oath. Other events omitted relevant information entirely. Nobody spoke for several seconds after the report appeared. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Michael looked around the room. Some spectators stared at the monitors. Others looked toward Rebecca. A few simply lowered their eyes. The atmosphere had changed completely. Weeks earlier, assumptions had filled the gaps where facts were missing. Now the facts themselves occupied the room. David returned to his seat without celebration. He had not delivered an emotional speech. He had not accused anyone of wrongdoing. He had simply connected the evidence. Piece by piece. Date by date. Fact by fact. Rebecca remained seated at the witness stand. Her earlier confidence was gone. Across the courtroom, the judge closed the final exhibit folder and looked toward both legal teams. The expression on his face revealed nothing. Yet everyone understood the same thing. The case no longer revolved around competing stories. The evidence had finally arrived. And once it appeared, the entire foundation of the dispute looked very different. The judge did not announce a decision immediately. Instead, he recessed the hearing and spent several days reviewing the evidence, witness testimony, forensic reports, and legal filings. For Michael Carter, those days felt longer than the previous several months combined. After everything that had been uncovered, he understood that the outcome no longer depended on public opinion. It depended on facts. and facts moved at their own pace. The following Friday, the courtroom filled once again. The atmosphere felt different from every prior hearing. There was less confidence. Less certainty. People entered quietly and took their seats without conversation. When the judge finally appeared, the room rose and then settled into complete silence. Michael sat beside David Reynolds and folded his hands together. Across the room, Rebecca remained composed, though the calm confidence that had once defined her presence seemed noticeably diminished. The judge began speaking. His voice was measured and precise. He reviewed the evidence carefully, walking through the chronology established during the proceedings. He referenced the recovered records, the archive analysis, the witness statements, and the inconsistencies identified between testimony and verified documentation. No dramatic language. No emotional observations. Just facts. One after another. The courtroom listened. Several times, the judge paused to emphasize the importance of accurate disclosures and truthful representations during legal proceedings. Then he addressed the central issue directly. Based on the evidence presented, significant portions of the disputed timeline could not be supported by the factual record. Certain statements had been contradicted by independently verified documentation. Other material information had been omitted. The conclusion changed the foundation of the case. Michael felt the tension leave his shoulders for the first time in months. Not because he was celebrating. Because he no longer felt trapped beneath assumptions. The judge proceeded to issue revised findings regarding financial matters and several disputed claims. Legal adjustments followed. Recommendations were entered into the record. Additional reviews would continue through appropriate channels. The process remained professional and orderly. Yet everyone in the room understood what had happened. The narrative that once seemed unquestionable had collapsed under scrutiny. When the hearing ended, people slowly began leaving the courtroom. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked thoughtful. A few appeared embarrassed by conclusions they had reached too quickly. Michael remained seated for several moments after everyone started moving. The room that had once felt suffocating now seemed strangely peaceful. David gathered his files and offered a small nod. Nothing more was necessary. Outside, the Arizona afternoon sun stretched across the courthouse plaza. Cars moved through downtown Phoenix. Pedestrians crossed intersections. Life continued exactly as it had before. Michael stepped through the courthouse doors and paused at the top of the steps. Months earlier, he had arrived there carrying anger, confusion, and the desperate need to defend himself. Now he carried something else. Clarity. His phone vibrated with incoming messages. Friends who suddenly wanted to reconnect. Colleagues who had followed the case. People offering congratulations. Michael ignored the notifications and slipped the phone back into his pocket. That was not what mattered. He looked toward the skyline shimmering in the afternoon heat. The truth had not changed the past. It had not erased the stress, the loneliness, or the damage done along the way. But it had done something equally important. It had restored reality. Michael took a slow breath and walked toward the parking lot. No victory speech waited for him. No dramatic confrontation. No desire for revenge. Some people spend their lives trying to win against others. Michael had learned a different lesson. The real victory was never about defeating Rebecca. It was about refusing to abandon the truth when everyone else seemed willing to believe something easier. And in the end, he did not win because someone else lost. He won because the truth finally had the chance to speak for itself.